You like my canoe paddle? At least the makings of one, because that's what we're building today. I'm Jeff, and you're watching Home Built Workshop. I feel that today's project deserves a little bit of an explanation, a little bit of the backstory as to why we're building a canoe paddle. Here at our house, we have a pond. Nothing special, just a little old farm pond. Lots of geese and wildlife and stuff. Really just a cool place to come and hang out. Up here at the end where the water flows into the pond, we had a bridge that would go across this little stream or the inlet. And we used this bridge. We use it to walk across and to get across there with the lawnmower so that I can mow some of the weeds on the side. A couple of weeks ago, we had a torrential rain and it washed our bridge all the way to the other side of the pond. It was way back in this area. When we went out to retrieve the bridge from way back there, we discovered it was still floating. So the curiosity set in and we decided to see that if it would hold us. Well, when I stepped on the bridge, it pretty much sank right away. But when Haley stepped on the bridge, we discovered that it would float her. Now there's no flotation or anything on the bottom of this bridge, it's just the buoyancy in the wood. So we got the wild idea to try to float this bridge across the pond to get it back into place with Haley on the top of the bridge. And actually, this worked really awesome. After floating the bridge close to where it belongs, we decided not to put it in place just yet because we had a couple of ideas for a project. When Haley was floating around on our little makeshift raft, the only thing we could really find to use to get around was a stick and a shovel for an oar. How's that shovel paddle working? If only you had like an actual oar of some sort. We'll have to see what we can do about that. So now you know why we're building what we're building, and now it's time to start building what we're building. I've got a piece of wood here. This is actually a piece of silver maple. I don't know how that's going to work for an oar material, but I feel like it's going to be hard enough that we don't have to worry about bashing up the end. To get started, I need to lay out a center line and figure out the shape that we're going to make this oar. I don't have any specific pattern for this. I've got some basic dimensions that I found online, and I'm going to use those kind of as a basis for my pattern. So let's get to drawing out some lines and try to find the oar that lives in this piece of wood. While creating this pattern, I found that my acoustic guitar template made for a nice radius for the paddle blade. Well, that makes up the basic shape. I think it looks pretty good. Now we just need to remove this excess material on the bandsaw. I guess I didn't hit record. Well, now I'm a little bit disgusted with myself. I just cut off all the waste material on the bandsaw. Knocked about a dozen things over due to the length and swinging this thing around in the shop. And I didn't hit record. Sorry about that. I didn't intend for you to miss it. But really, just cut away the waste material based on the pattern that we drew on there. Now, we're ready to start shaping on this thing. I'm going to use this high-tech gadget, which is, well, basically just a marking gauge, but instead of a scribe, I've got a pencil in there. I'm going to draw a center line all the way around the outside edge. This is going to help give us some guidelines once we start to shape everything. After marking out the center line all the way around the piece, I readjusted the radius gauge to give me another pair of lines that represent a 1/4 inch thickness at the edge of the paddle. This is where I'm going to thin the blades down to when it comes down to the final carving. Now that I have the outside thickness of the blade marked out, I need to remove some of this material from the blade overall. I need to bring the thickness of that portion down before I start tapering it into this center 1/4 inch. I've got my marking gauge readjusted once again. I'm going to scribe one more set of lines to mark where I need to thin the entire blade. There's a lot of pencil marks on here. I got to remember what's what. I'm going to try to thin this whole blade down to a 1/2 inch, maybe 9/16 or so. Now if I had a larger bandsaw, I would just take this to the bandsaw and basically resaw these thin sections off of the outside, which would thin the entire blade very quickly. Unfortunately, I don't have a bandsaw that large. So we're going to have to do this a little different. I decided to try to use the drum sander to thin this blade out. In order to be able to feed this in and out of there by hand, I put a piece of plexiglass down so that the piece would slide into the sander instead of getting stuck on the feed belt of the drum sander. This actually worked out really well. I just fed it in by hand, lowered the drum just a little, and kept repeating that process until I'd sanded away the material that I needed to. It took a little bit of time, but overall it worked great. Well, I finished thinning up both sides. It kind of looks a little bit more like a paddle already. It did get a little bit tricky when working on the second side because the already contoured side was down. So to get around that, I double-sided taped a piece of scrap to the bottom. That helped keep the paddle nice and flat on the drum sander. I'll just pop this off. Now, is using the drum sander that way the only way to do this? Absolutely not. There's a bunch of different ways. I mentioned the bandsaw already and slicing some of this off. I've also seen people use just hand planes. Plane that down and it works just fine. Whatever method works for you, go ahead and use it as long as you can get the job done. I've also seen people just glue these up using thinner wings. Then that almost eliminates a lot of the extra work. But nonetheless, we're ready to move on. Before I can begin shaping, I need to remark the center line on the blade. Now comes what I think is going to be the real work. We need to now taper this blade from the center out to the edge while staying within my 1/4 inch marks. I need to do this on both sides. It's going to kind of make this into a V shape. To help me keep things in alignment, I'm just going to draw a bunch of pencil marks on here so I can see where the hand plane's cutting. I'm starting off using my hand plane to try to remove the bulk of the material. This was a bit of a workout and it did take some time, but once I got down close to my line, I switched over to my trusty Shinto rasp to make sure everything's even and try to get it as smooth as possible. Well, it looks like my tapers are pretty close to my lines. A little bit of cleanup yet to do. I'm sweating like crazy. This is a lot of work. Now, we're ready, I think, to repeat that exact same process. I gotta do that all over again to the back side. I'm gonna spare you guys the details of this because it's gonna be identical to this one. We'll be right back when both of these are carved away. Once I finished carving the second side, I decided to try the belt sander, which is one of my least favorite tools, to smooth out both sides of the blade and sand it nice and smooth. One of the main reasons I don't like the belt sander is because you have to be very careful that one of the edges doesn't catch because it'll very quickly burn a nice gouge in your piece that's really hard to remove. To avoid a little bit of that danger, I'm using a 220 grit sanding belt, which takes a little bit longer, but it removes much less material than if you're using like an 80 grit or something really coarse. I did get a couple very small lines from the belt sander that I was easily able to remove using the random orbit sander. Well, I think that takes care of most of the shaping at this end. There's still some final sanding to do, but now I want to focus on getting the rest of this thing rounded over and shaped so that it's nice and comfortable. First, I want to put a little bit of a relief, a scallop, I don't know what you might want to call it, up here at the end so that it makes sort of a handle and makes it a little bit more comfortable to hold on to. To quickly carve this out, I just used the coarsest half-round rasp that I have, and it took only a few minutes really to carve this wood away. And my rolling pin sander removed the coarse rasp marks very quickly. If you're interested in making a rolling pin sander like this, I've got a video doing just that, link in the description. To speed up the process of rounding over the handle, I'm going to use a roundover bit in my router to remove the majority of the material. Well, that made a giant mess, but it made super quick work of getting this roughly shaped. And now we've reached the point in this project where the only proper thing to do is put on some headphones, crank up your favorite music. It's time to finish sanding this thing. Well, after what feels like an entire day of sanding, I've got one last finishing touch before we apply the finish. That turned out really good. Well, we've come to the point in the project where I need to apply a finish to this thing. I want to use a finish that is both waterproof and has some UV protection since this is going to be outside. Now there's a lot of different ways you could go as far as finish, but the one that I'm going to use is just regular old spar urethane. It's easily available, you can pick it up all over the place, and really it's pretty simple to apply. Now I know from experience that spar urethane, even though it's rated for outdoors with the UV protection and everything, it's not going to last forever. This thing is going to require some maintenance. At the bare minimum, at least sanding it down lightly and reapplying a fresh coat. I'm totally okay with that. If that's something that you really don't want to have to mess with, you might look at other options. There's some epoxy coatings that I've seen work really well. There's also the tung oil type finish, but that one is also going to require some maintenance. So if you're building a project like this, make sure you do your research and choose the finish that works best for you. I'm going to do my best to follow the instructions from the manufacturer for this particular finish, which calls for a minimum of 3 coats, waiting at least 4 hours in between each coat, and then a full 24 hours for the whole thing to dry. So since I've got a little bit of time to let this dry, I want to try to make this bridge float a little bit better. I think it would be awesome if we could both float on this thing and paddle around with our new paddle. So let's see what we can do. I don't know if this is going to work or not, but I know one way to find out. After dragging our bridge raft up on the ground where I can get to it a little bit better, I flipped it upside down and I decided to try attaching a bunch of pool noodles to the bottom. Now I don't really know how many we're going to need, but I'm going to start out with 6 and we'll see what happens. I'm using some long construction grade screws to go straight through the foam of the pool noodle and right into the boards of the bridge. What do you think? Is that going to be enough? I feel like we're going to need more, but we gotta test it. Janky raft? Check. Handmade canoe paddle? Check. I am really happy with the way this thing turned out. Of course, we haven't tested it actually in use yet, but as far as how it looks, I am really happy. It's comfortable to hang on to. A little bit of an oval shape on the handle. Really, I think it's gonna work out really well. This paddle does have a little bit of flex in the blade. Of course, what we're gonna be using this for, I don't think the amount of flex really matters, but there is a little bit there. Now, all we really need to do is try this thing out. Is our raft gonna sink? We know it won't sink with Haley on there, so she'll be able to paddle around just fine. I just don't know if it's gonna hold me as well. So Haley's up first for the maiden voyage? I don't know, she looks a little apprehensive. Is she doubting our raft? It's launch time. It looks to me like it's floating higher already.
Yeah.
Let's see what happens. Haley's gonna go first. Hey, nice paddle. Now I already knew this was gonna float her because, well, this thing floated her before we added the noodles, but at least she got to try out the paddle. Is that paddle easier to use than the shovel?
Definitely.
All right. Now it's time for me to hop on and see what happens. When I first stepped on, it seemed okay, but after a few seconds, it started going under. Huh? Nope. I mean, it was holding us for a second. Well, it turns out we don't quite have enough flotation to float both Haley and I, but I can sit in a lawn chair and float around on the pond. We're gonna have to work on the flotation. The paddle is working amazing. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Thanks a lot for watching. We'll see you next time.